This week's lab covers the different types of tissues that we've talked about in lecture. So for lab, you will need to be able to identify certain types of tissues. We'll go over all the tissues that we've talked about in lecture, but there are certain ones that I would like for you to be able to identify for lab, and also have some additional information as far as knowing some of the common organs where you would find different types of tissue in abundance, and being able to identify those organs and um, associate those organs with particular types of tissue. So let's get into it. All right, so we've talked about the four main types or main categories of tissue. So epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Right? For epithelial tissue, we've talked about the two ways that we would classify different types of epithelial tissue based on two criteria. One, the number of cell rows, whether it is one row of epithelial cells or multiple rows. If it's one row, we're talking about simple epithelial tissue. If it's more than one row of cells, stratified. The second criteria that we use to classify epithelial tissue is based on the shape of cells that you find in the apical layer or the apical row. The apical layer or the apical row, if you will recall, is the row of cells that is either facing the lumen or the opening of an organ or facing outside of the body. All right, so the three different cell shapes that we will look for in that apical row to classify it: squamous, your flat cells with flattened nuclei; cuboid or cuboidal cells that are cube-shaped or square-shaped with almost a perfectly spherical nucleus; and then your columnar shaped cells, which are elongated or rectangular shaped like a vertical rectangle with a kind of oval shaped nucleus near the basal end or basal part of the cell. Connective tissue is where things get a little bit more complex. For connective tissue, we get four different subcategories. Within those subcategories, we get what I'm going to be referring to as like a subcategory or even a subcategory. So for connective tissue, there are four subcategories: connective tissue proper, cartilage, bone, and blood. For the subcategory of connective tissue proper, you get two subcategories, loose and dense. For each of those subcategories, you get three subcategories. So for loose, you have areolar, adipose, or reticular, and for dense, regular, irregular, or elastic. For cartilage, the subcategory of cartilage, you get three subcategories. So hyaline, elastic, or fibrocartilage. For the subcategory of bone, you can either have compact or spongy. We'll talk about that more later when we talk about the skeletal system and bone and how it's formed. For now, we'll just kind of think about bone as bone, right? So we won't really make the distinction right now between compact and spongy. And then for the subcategory, blood is just blood. So there are no subcategories or subcategories for blood. Blood is just blood, right? Muscle tissue is pretty easy. You only get three subcategories, so skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, or smooth muscle. And then nervous tissue doesn't have any subcategories. Nervous tissue is just nervous tissue. So out of all of these different main types of tissues and their subcategories or subcategories, the tissues that you see listed on this slide are the tissues that you need to be able to identify for lab. So for practical number one, you need to be able to identify the tissue types that you see on this slide. right? And we're going to go through and look at all of these. If you would like to earn some bonus points on Practical 1, the tissue types that you see listed on this slide will be bonus questions. So if you can not only identify all the tissues on the previous slide, but if you can also identify the tissues that you see listed here, you can earn some bonus points. All right, so starting with epithelial tissue, on this slide I've listed all of the different types of epithelial tissue that you are either kind of required to know for the practical or maybe a bonus on the practical. So the types of epithelial tissue that you see with a little asterisk next to them are the types of epithelial tissue that you need to know how to identify for the practical that are definitely going to be on the practical, right? So simple columnar, transitional, pseudostratified, and stratified squamous. Simple squamous and simple cuboidal you may see as bonus questions, right? Notice that we see simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar, and we see stratified squamous, but no stratified cuboidal, no stratified columnar, right? Those two types of tissue, as we have touched on in lecture, are rare types of epithelial tissue. So we're not even going to concern ourselves with looking at those, right? But how we would still classify those would be based on they have multiple layers of epithelial cells. And then in that apical row or apical layer, if we're talking about stratified cuboidal, we would find the cuboidal cells. If it's stratified columnar, we would have the columnar shaped cells, all right? You may see me refer to cuboid cells as cuboidal, same thing, right? So starting with simple columnar epithelial tissue. So we'll look at some distinctive characteristics, some things to look for to help you know that you are looking at this particular type of tissue. And then we'll also look at the function of that tissue, just a general function of when you see this type of tissue in organs throughout the body, what is the purpose in that tissue being there, right? What purpose, what function is it serving? Kind of in a broad general sense. And then we'll look at some examples of where you would find this type of tissue in the body, kind of in abundance. So for simple columnar epithelial tissue, distinctive characteristics. So you're going to look for a pretty distinctive, well-defined row of cells that are all vertical, rectangular shaped, where the nucleus, so that darkened, stained area that you see in each of these cells in the image to your left, are the nuclei. You're going to look for not only that elongated rectangular shape of the cell, but then also you can look at the shape of the nuclei within those cells and see how the nuclei in those cells are all kind of like oval shaped or stretched and elongated down toward the basal layer or basal end of the cell. So where you see the white between where you see the two rows of cells come together, that would be the lumen of the organ. So the opening, the inside of the organ. All right. Where you typically find simple columnar epithelial tissue would be lining the inside of like your digestive organs, particularly your intestines, small intestine, large intestine, and then within the bronchi, within the lungs. Simple columnar epithelial tissue, it's predominantly functioning in secreting some type of substance or absorbing things, right? For all simple epithelial tissue, we see this kind of shared function of absorption. That one layer of cells makes it easier for different substances to be able to pass into the tissue, pass into the body for absorption. Pseudostratified epithelial tissue. So pay close attention to the name here. Pseudo meaning false, stratified. So false stratified. So for pseudostratified epithelial tissue, it's going to appear as if there are multiple rows of cells, but there is only one row of cells, right? As we just saw with simple columnar epithelial tissue, all of the cells were perfectly aligned and adjacent to each other. They were maintaining kind of that perfect column or rectangular shape, right? With pseudostratified epithelial tissue, you get kind of columnar shaped cells, but now instead of them all being kind of uniformly arranged and having their own space, with pseudostratified, you now get those columnar shaped cells that are so tightly packed together that they are causing misshapening and misalignment of each other. So if you look closely at some of these cells, you can kind of make out where one cell is kind of defined, right? It's not as distinctive. The different cells are not as distinctively defined as what we saw with simple columnar, but you can still kind of make out how the cells are shaped, and you can see how they're all kind of just pushed together so that where you have maybe two nuclei right next to each other, kind of one on top of the other, that is where two cells are pushed tightly together so that one nucleus of one, or the nucleus of one cell is kind of slightly below the nucleus of the adjacent cell. All right. The large white kind of globules that you see within the cells, those are either goblet cells or some type of gland that's going to be producing like a mucus, right? So one thing I didn't point out with the simple columnar epithelial tissue was, if we go back, if we were to go back, we could see cilia, right, within the lumen. Not as prominent as you see here with the pseudostratified, but there was a clear kind of darkened purple line as you see here with the pseudostratified. And then there was a little light area of staining right above that darkened line with the simple columnar. With the pseudostratified, we still see that dark line outlining where the apical surface of the cell is. And then above that, facing into the lumen, we can clearly see the cilia where they're well defined here with the pseudostratified, right? So function of pseudostratified being that it is simple epithelial tissue, we're still thinking about secreting things, hence the reason why we see the goblet cells or the mucus cells. They're going to be secreting a substance. And then also filtration. So because we see a lot of cilia here, we know that these cells are going to be trying to filter things and monitor or restrict what's able to pass into this tissue, to pass into the body. So where we find pseudostratified epithelial tissue, upper respiratory tract, so like the trachea or the windpipe, the trachea is the windpipe, to some extent within your larynx as well, so kind of up above where the trachea is, so like where the voice box is, right? Those cilia are going to try to sweep any particles that we don't want getting deeper into the respiratory system, into the lungs, try to sweep it back out of the body and trigger like a cough reflex in order to get it back up out of the body and away from the lungs. Stratified squamous epithelial tissue. So this is the tissue that makes up our skin, right? So stratified, we know we're going to see multiple rows of cells. Squamous is telling us that that row of cells at the apical layer or the apical row are going to be flattened. So if we look at this image, where all the pink is would be where your epithelial tissue is. So your stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Down here where we see kind of the beige tissue with maybe a few little specks of pink cells would be underlying connective tissue. So if you look at where we have this white, that white is telling us that's either the lumen or the outside of the body. If we look at the cells that are facing that outside area of the body, or if this were a different type of tissue, maybe the lumen, we can see that the nuclei are all flattened or kind of squished. So even if you can't make out any particular cells, you can't tell where one cell starts and the next one begins, right? You can always look at the nuclei. So even though it just kind of all looks like a kind of light pink blur, we can clearly see the nuclei and see that they're flattened up here at this apical layer or apical row or surface. So we know that these are squamous cells. Down here where the epithelial tissue meets with the underlying connective tissue, notice the nuclei down here. They're more rounded. So the epithelial cells that you see down here connecting to the connective tissue would be cuboid or cuboidal, right? But we're not worried about this basal layer or the basal row down here. We're always going to focus on the apical layer, right? So this image over here that we'll look at more in-depthly when we start talking about the integumentary system shows us a model of what the skin looks like. So in this model of skin, we can see that top layer, that kind of tan brown layer that they have depicted there, would be where your epithelial tissue is, where that stratified squamous epithelial tissue is. Once we get, and that stratified squamous epithelial tissue is the epidermis. Right? We'll talk about that later when we talk about the integumentary system. Once you get below the epithelial tissue, so all of the pink down here, not including where the hair follicles are, but all of the kind of pink coloration down here, all of that is your dermis. The dermis is made up of connective tissue. So we've talked about in lecture, anytime you have epithelial tissue, you're going to find it adjacent to connective tissue underneath, right? The two go hand in hand, they support each other, right? And down here at the bottom of this model, where you see the larger blood vessels, where you see these yellow goblets, those yellow goblets are fat, and so this very bottom layer of this skin model down here is your hypodermis or your subcutaneous tissue. That is also going to have some connective tissue, but as you can see, it's a lot of fat, so it's mostly going to be your adipose or your fat. Transitional epithelial tissue is a type of stratified epithelial tissue. So this tissue may look a little bit similar to the pseudostratified, right? In that you can't really make out any distinctive row of cells from another row. You can clearly see that there are multiple, or what appears to be multiple rows of cells, right? Because you see multiple nuclei all kind of on top of each other, so kind of creating rows. With transitional epithelial tissue, one way to clearly tell it from pseudostratified is to look for the cilia. We don't see that well-defined darkened stained line here at the apical surface. So we're not, and then we don't see anything that could look like little cilia, little hair sticking up from that apical surface. So if you don't see that, you're probably looking at transitional epithelial tissue, right? So if you are presented with an image that you're able to figure out it's epithelial tissue because you see that it is multiple cells all compacted together, you can't really make out distinctive rows, so you're not quite sure if it's pseudostratified or if it's transitional. Look for cilia. If there are no cilia, you're looking at transitional, which is stratified epithelial tissue. So there are multiple rows of cells here. They're just not well defined, and the cells are not any one particular shape in each row, right? Which kind of adds to the fact that the tissue looks kind of all jumbled up, right? Because when we think back to the simple columnar epithelial tissue, all the cells were like those perfect rectangular column-shaped cells, right? With this, we have different shapes of cells kind of in every row, all right? So kind of imagine like a stone wall, like an ancient stone wall where all of the stones are kind of different shapes, but they all fit together tightly, right? So transitional epithelial tissue that is stratified won't have well-defined, distinguishable cell shapes because this type of tissue is meant to be able to stretch and recoil, right? In stretching and recoiling is going to allow for the organs where this tissue is found to be protected so that they don't rupture if they start to enlarge too much, okay, to a certain point at least. So where you typically find transitional epithelial tissue within the bladder, within the urethra, within the ureters, so within the urinary organs, right, that are going to need to be able to stretch to fill with urine, but then when urine is released, recoil to some extent, right, to kind of a more resting shape when the bladder's not full or when urine's not moving through the urethra or the ureters. So moving on to connective tissue. So connective tissue is the type of tissue where we see a lot of different subcategories and sub-subcategories and more complexity, right? For all of the different subcategories and sub-subcategories of connective tissue, they all have two things in common. One, they're all made up of ground substance, fibers, and cells. And two, they all arise from that mesenchymal tissue, that embryonic tissue when we're developing within the womb, right? So the different types of connective tissue, they may seem very different, but the reason why they're all grouped under that umbrella term of connective tissue is because they have those two things in common. They are all made up of the same three elements, just in different amounts, and then they all come from the same type of embryonic tissue. So on this first slide of looking at connective tissue, again, the subcategories that you see with the little asterisk are the ones that you definitely need to be able to identify. If there's not an asterisk next to it, you may see it on the practical, but it's going to be a bonus question. All right. So again, more subcategories of connective tissue. Look for the asterisk. If it doesn't have an asterisk, a bonus question. All right. So starting with the first subcategory of connective tissue. So connective tissue proper. All right. Connective tissue proper has a subcategory being loose. One of the subcategories of loose connective tissue proper connective tissue is areolar. So if you wanted to classify or name this type of tissue in its full name, you would tell me it's connective tissue proper, loose, areolar, right? So we said connective tissue, no matter what subcategory or subcategory, they're all going to have ground substance, cells, and fibers. For connective tissue proper, loose, we're going to see an abundance of ground substance, different degrees of fibers, and then different degrees of cells, right? Kind of moderate amounts of fibers and cells. So for the areolar type of loose connective tissue proper connective tissue, in this image you can see where there's a lot of kind of white or kind of pink, light pink shading in the background of this image. All of the white or kind of light pink shading represents the ground substance, right? And so you can see there's quite a lot of the white or the light pink. Where you see the more kind of defined pink, kind of the darker pink where it looks like it's strings or kind of little coils, those are your fibers. And then all the little dots that you see, all the little kind of purple or blue looking dots that you see are your cells. All right. The function of this type of connective tissue is to provide support and provide cushioning, and to be what's kind of referred to sometimes as a packaging material. So yet again, we see this model of skin. So we just talked about a few slides back that top layer of this model is your epidermis, which is made up of your stratified squamous epithelial tissue. We said once we get below that to where we have the light pink down here with all the different glands and hair follicles and everything in it, that light pink area down here is connective tissue, making up your dermis. The dermis is going to be made up of two different types of connective tissue. So where I have this blue arrow pointing to kind of that very top part of the connective tissue that's directly adjacent to and underneath the epithelial tissue, that top layer of connective tissue is your areolar connective tissue. All right, so it's providing cushioning and it's providing support to the epithelial tissue above it. Sticking with connective tissue proper, loose, now we have adipose. Adipose is just fat, all right? So if we look at this image and we look for those three elements, right? Fibers, cells, and ground substance. We see these large white structures that look like they could be cells. So we see a lot of cells, right? Those large white structures that you see are in fact fat droplets, right? So cells that are filled with fat. So you see like the nuclei that are directly adjacent to or kind of pushed to the outside of some of these fat droplets. So the nucleus of those cells, right, are either cells that are kind of being squished by those fat droplets. So we see fat droplets. The fat droplets you can think of as cells. So we see a lot of cells. We see white or kind of light lavender coloration surrounding all of the fat droplets. So that's your ground substance. We don't really see any distinctive fibers, right? Adipose will have some fibers, but they're not going to be as distinctive, and you're not going to see as many fibers within adipose tissue as you would with areolar, right? So the function of adipose tissue, also providing cushioning, Also serving as fuel storage. The whole point in our body storing fat is to have that fat as a fuel reserve for if we enter a state of starvation, our body can start using that fat to make energy. So where we find fat, you can find fat throughout the body, right? But one area that we can find fat is within that hypodermis or the subcutaneous tissue. Again, thinking about the skin and the skin model, right? The hypodermis and the subcutaneous tissue, same thing. They're not technically a part of skin, but you will often see the hypodermis included with skin models because it's the next type of tissue that you run into moving from superficial to deeper into the body. Still thinking about connective tissue um, and connective tissue proper, but now thinking about dense connective tissue proper. One of the sub categories of dense connective tissue proper is regular, right? So again, we have to think about those three elements: ground substance, fibers, and cells. If we look at this image, if we're thinking about ground substance as being like white or light coloration, right? Whatever the stain is, the predominant stain color is, if it's pink, if it's like a light pink, or if it's blue, but there's a light blue kind of in the background, that's your ground substance. Or if it's white, that's your ground substance. So in this image, we see some white, not a lot. So we see some ground substance, but not a lot. But what we do notice, or what we should notice, is that there's this clear kind of wave pattern that looks like waves in the ocean, right, of this pink. Those pink waves that you see are fibers. So with dense connective tissue proper, you're going to see a lot of fibers that are going to be densely compacted together, hence the name. Also, think about the pattern that you're seeing. It's like a fluid, regular pattern to those pink fibers, hence the name dense, regular connective tissue proper, right? As far as cells go, where you have these dark purple stained areas, those are nuclei of cells, where the cells are being squished by all of those dense fibers that you see. So you see some cells, but not a lot. So with dense connective tissue proper, particularly, we're looking at the regular right now, you see a lot of fibers, you see a little bit of ground substance and a few cells, but not a lot. Where we typically see this type of connective tissue, so we see it making up muscle tendons, we see it making up ligaments that hold bones together at joints. So the whole purpose or the function of this type of tissue is to attach things together, attach bones together, attach muscle to bone, and to provide strength in those attachment points. Right. Moving on to the second subcategory of connective tissue. So now we're looking at cartilage, right? Still talking about connective tissue, so we're still going to look for the three elements. So the first thing we're going to look for is how much ground substance, right? Do we see white or do we see light shading? And we see both in abundance, right? We see some white, but then we also see a lot of kind of light pink shading in the background here. So we see, a moderate amount of ground substance. Do we see any fibers? The fibers are not as well defined here, right? You can kind of maybe see within that ground substance where you maybe see what looks like some little strings or thread-like structures that are your fibers, but they're not as well defined, not a lot of them. But what you do see prominently are these white circular structures with the dark spot inside. These are easy to be confused with cells, right? It's easy to look at this and say, oh, well, those are cells with the nuclei inside, right? Because that's what we saw with epithelial tissue. We saw, the dark spot inside of either a square shaped or rectangular shaped or flattened structure being the nucleus. The dark coloration that you see here is the nucleus, but that large white structure surrounding that is not the cell. So the dark spots that you see are nuclei inside of cells, right? But the larger white structures surrounding that are structures known as lacunae. So for cartilage, and then later when we look at bone, you will see the lacunae structures. They're more prominent when we talk about cartilage, but we'll also see them to a lesser extent when we look at bone. So when it comes to being able to distinguish cartilage from, say, connective tissue proper, if you see these large white structures with the dark stained nuclei inside, right? These are lacunae. So if you see anything that looks like that, know that you're looking at cartilage. From there, the only thing you need to do is figure out what type of cartilage are you looking at. Are you looking at this hyaline cartilage? Or are you looking at the elastic or the fibrocartilage? Right? So the function of hyaline cartilage to provide support, to resist compression, and to also provide reinforcement. So you find this type of cartilage surrounding the ends of your long bones, so like around the head of like your femur. It'll be surrounding that within that joint where the femur joins into the hip joint to provide like attachment as well as to resist the bones pressing together and rubbing together to create friction of that bone on bone, right? You also find hyaline cartilage within the nose. So the tip of the nose that you can kind of move and flex around is hyaline cartilage. You also find it where your ribs meet with the sternum. Right. The third subcategory of connective tissue. So now we're looking at bone, right? Bone should be probably one of the easiest types of tissues to recognize because if you look at this image, it should make you think about maybe the rings of a tree trunk, right? If you've ever seen a tree that's been cut down and like the rings that, back in elementary school, someone probably told you if you count the rings of a tree, you can figure out how old the tree is, right? The more rings, the older the tree. So this image that looks like maybe a forest of trees has been cut down and you're looking at all those rings within the tree trunks is your bone, right? All of the circles that you see that resemble tree trunks are known as osteomes. So we'll talk about this later when we talk about skeletal system and bone, but all of those different osteomes make up the bone tissue, right? In the center of the osteomes is where you have your central canal, so that's this dark spot. All of the little dark, kind of squished, concentric circles that you see making up the rings of the osteomes are your lacunae with cells inside. So this is why I said you still see lacunae when we talk about bone, but the lacunae are not as well defined or not the exact same structure as what we see with cartilage. All right. The function of bone to provide support. So bone is basically like the framework for the body or the scaffolding for the body, right? Everything is going to attach to the bone for the bone to support and hold the body up, right? Bone also provides protection. So when we think about like your rib cage is going to protect like your lungs, your heart, to some extent, some of your like digestive organs that kind of dip down like where your liver is. Um, your superior aspect of your spine. So kind of creates like a cage of support, right, for your some of your organs. And then where do we find bone in the body? Throughout, right? Throughout the entire body. All right. So moving on to muscle tissue. So three different types or subcategories of muscle tissue. We have skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. Now we can look at all three here side by side and notice similarities and differences. For skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, right out of the gate you should notice that you see like these elongated kind of horizontal rectangular shape structures, right? Those horizontal rectangular shape structures are your muscle cells. When we talk about the muscular system, we'll talk about how muscle cells are fiber shaped. They're elongated and not your typical what you would consider like a cell shape, right? So we clearly see the elongated fiber shapes to the cells for skeletal muscle and for cardiac muscle. For smooth muscle, it's um, not as clear, right? We see like some elongation to the structures that we're seeing, but not kind of that column rectangle shape as what we see with skeletal and cardiac, right? For skeletal and cardiac, notice that you see the alternating kind of dark pink, light pink, dark pink, light pink, along where we have the cells, right? So this entire structure would be a cell, this would be a cell, this, etc. So for each of those cells, now you have notice that you have those alternating patterns of light pink, dark pink, light pink, dark pink. Those are your striations. So skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle will both have striations, right? Cardiac muscle here, when we look at it, is maybe not as well defined, but you can still make out a pattern of dark and pink striations. How you can really tell the difference between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle is to look for these structures. So these vertical dark stain lines, which are your intercalated disc, right? Intercalated disc are where your cardiac muscle cells come together, right? So muscle, as far as skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle, should be easy to identify as muscle, right? And then you only need to be able to distinguish between, okay, am I looking at skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle, right? And look for the intercalated disc. If you see the intercalated disc, you're looking at cardiac. Smooth muscle, though, doesn't look exactly like its two muscle counterparts over here, right? We said the cells are not the like rectangle shape that you see the other two types of muscle. We see elongated cell structures, but not the rectangle shape. So if you see elongated, horizontally elongated cells like this, that are tightly compacted together, you're looking at smooth muscle, right? It may be easy to confuse this with epithelial tissue, But remember, if you're looking at epithelial tissue, it's always going to have connective tissue underneath it or around it in some way, right? So since we are just seeing rows and rows and rows of like elongated cells here with the kind of flattened nuclei inside, don't mistake this for like a stratified squamous. If it were stratified squamous, we would see like maybe down here at the bottom or somewhere here, they would have shown us that connective tissue surrounding it. All right. So skeletal muscle, um, again, look for the elongated horizontal cells with the striations. Function, voluntary movement, right? We can voluntarily control our biceps, our triceps, quads, hamstrings, right? We consciously control how we're moving our arms or legs. So where you find skeletal muscle tissue in the body, anywhere you have voluntary muscles. So arms, legs, your ab muscles, your back muscles, anything that we can consciously control when the muscle functions and moves things. Cardiac muscle, we said you're going to look for the intercalated disc. Cardiac muscle functions in involuntary movement, specifically the involuntary movement or beating of the heart. So the only place in the body you're going to find cardiac muscle is within the heart, right? Involuntary movement because we can't consciously control our heartbeat. We can't think heart beat faster or heart beat slower, right? And then smooth muscle. Smooth muscle, again, we said look for elongated cells, but make that distinction between the elongation of these cells and squamous cells, right? If you're looking at epithelial, like squamous epithelial tissue, you would see the connective tissue, right? We don't see that here. So we're looking at smooth muscle. We don't see striations. Smooth muscle is also going to function in involuntary movement and propulsion of things. So smooth muscle would be found like in your digestive organs, within some of your urinary organs, and your blood vessels. So places where we need to move things, we need to move substances, right? We need to move food through the digestive tract, or we need to move blood through the blood vessels, but we're not consciously controlling that. So it's involuntary. Right? Bonus tissues. So on this slide, I've put all of and the following slide as well, all of the bonus tissues that if you want to try to get bonus points on the practical, you may want to know how to identify these types of tissue, right? So this first one, connective tissue proper, loose, reticular. What you should notice about it that looks similar to the other two sub categories of loose connective tissue proper that we looked at, areolar and adipose. The reticular tissue here, we see a lot of ground substance, we see a lot of white, we see a lot of cells, and we see some fibers. So the kind of dark string-like structures here are your fibers. So we see kind of moderate fibers, right? So if you're looking at loose connective tissue, you're gonna, again, we said you're gonna see a lot of ground substance and or a lot of cells, right? For connective tissue proper, dense, irregular, notice we don't see a lot of cells. We see maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 that we can clearly make out. We don't see a lot of cells. We don't see a lot of ground substance. Remember the white or like the really light kind of pale coloration would be ground substance. We don't see that here. We see a lot of blue and we see a lot of purple and maybe some white kind of peeking out between the blue and the purple. So not a lot of ground substance, not a lot of cells, but a lot of this blue and purple kind of jumbled up mesh. The blue and purple are fibers, right? With regular dense connective tissue proper, remember it was like a smooth wave of pink fibers all lined up together in a regular pattern. Here, all of the fibers are just kind of randomly kind of sprawled about, so an irregular pattern, right? For connective tissue proper, dense, elastic, yet again, we're talking about dense connective tissue proper. So we don't see a lot of ground substance. We don't see a lot of white in here, or kind of light pale coloration. We can't really make out any distinctive cells. There are cells in there, but we just can't really make them out, right? So it's probably not a lot. But we do see a lot of fibers. So all these little string-like coils that you see packed together are your fibers. So dense fibers that are all packed together, right? In a somewhat regular pattern, but notice how these fibers look a little bit more kind of stretchy, right? They look like they have kind of more elasticity, kind of more stretch and recoil to them than what we saw with the regular dense connective tissue. And then connective tissue, cartilage, fibrocartilage. So we see a lot of fibers. So all of the purple, all of the blue, those are your fibers. We see some ground substance. And then we have, yet again, thinking about cartilage, we have these white structures with the stained nuclei representing cells inside. So we see lacunae. So we see a lot of fibers, and then we see lacunae, right? So if you see a lot of fibers with lacunae, fibrocartilage. Connective tissue, cartilage, elastic. We don't see a lot of ground substance. We can see some fibers. So all of these kind of like strings, spiderweb looking structures are your fibers. And then we have these large circular purple stained structures with the white spots inside. Those are your lacunae. And this time those white spots inside are representing or showing us the cells within the lacunae, right? Notice the kind of spiderweb looking fibers in here. Notice that they look kind of like they're coiled or kind of stretchy. So kind of think about that and think about elastic, right? They kind of look similar in shape to the elastic fibers that we looked at for dense connective tissue proper. And then connective tissue blood, right? Remember blood, like bone, we said we're just going to think about that one subcategory, right? Just blood is blood, bone is bone. So for connective tissue blood, we see a lot of ground substance. So the ground substance in blood is your plasma, so the fluid part of blood. We don't see any fibers, right? The fibers in blood are kind of dissolved, right? Blood will have some fibers, but not a lot, and what fibers do exist are going to be in a dissolved state until they need to kind of condense and become more solid. And then we see a lot of cells. So all the pink or the purple larger cells or structures here are cells. And then a couple of epithelial tissues that we didn't talk about. So like simple squamous, simple meaning one row, squamous, your flattened cells. So this first image here would be what you would expect to see with like a simple squamous epithelial tissue. And then the middle image here, simple cuboid or simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Notice that we clearly see like circular structures that are made of cells, right? It's not like the circular structure of like a lacunae, where it's just a circular structure with one cell inside. Notice that we have cells that are forming circular structures here. For some of these circular structures, so like this one, we can make out that the cells are square shaped. But even if you can't quite make out the shape of the cell, again, look at the nuclei. The nuclei here throughout look pretty almost perfectly spherical shaped. So if it's an almost perfectly spherical or round shaped nucleus, it's a cuboidal cell. So simple cuboidal. Because there's only one row of these cells that are cuboid shaped. And then the last tissue type, your nervous tissue. Easy way to tell nervous tissue. So these dark stained structures that you see, these are nervous tissue cells, aka neurons. Neurons are going to have a very distinctive structure and shape to them because they're going to have a cell body with all of these processes or these like string-like structures that are extending out from the body. Those are the processes of your neurons. So if you see any kind of weird looking structures like this, these are cells with processes. So your neurons. All right. So a quick practice, just a few slides of helping you kind of look at images of tissue and try to figure out what it is you're looking at, right? Where to even start with that. So starting with this first one, right? It may or may not be easy, right? But I'm going to show you how you can make it easy, even if it's not, obviously easy right out of the gate here. All right, so some things you can do to try to figure out what it is you're looking at. The first thing you need to do is try to figure out which of the four main types of tissue it is you're viewing, right? To do that, consider what are the defining characteristics of the four main types of tissue: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous, right? For nervous tissue, we just looked at it. We said you're going to look for those weird shaped cells, which are the neurons. Do we see that here? No, right? So then think about muscle tissue. Muscle tissue, you're going to look for horizontally shaped elongated cells that are packed closely or tightly together in multiple rows. We don't see that here, right? Even though you may be saying, well, there are 2 rows, but these rows are separate from each other, right? Because we have the lumen here. When we're talking about multiple rows, we would be saying like the row that you see here, and then underneath it a row, and then underneath that a row. We don't see that here. We see a row of column-shaped cells or rectangular-shaped cells, and then we have space, so the lumen, before we get to the other side of this organ. All right? So muscle tissue, I don't think it's muscle tissue. Also, notice that where you have this distinctive row of cells, once we get below that, we run into connective tissue, right? So muscle tissue, we can count that out. So then we're thinking, is it one of the types of connective tissues or is it epithelial? Connective tissue, we're going to look for cells. Okay, I see cells. We can look for fibers. I don't see any fibers, right? But some of the connective tissues may not have visible fibers, so that, doesn't really cancel anything out. Do we see blood cells? No. Do we see the osteomes that you find in bone? No. And do we see lacunae? No. So connective tissue looking kind of iffy, right? Maybe, maybe not. But let's think about epithelial tissue. Do we see what looks like a single row of cells or multiple rows of cells with kind of clearly defined nuclei. We do, right? So based on that, you can, through the process of elimination, come to epithelial tissue being your answer. So once you determine that it's epithelial tissue that you're looking at, all you have to do is determine how you're going to classify it, right? How many rows of cells do you see? Well, there's only one row, one clearly defined row of cells here, because once we get down here, then we're hitting what would be your connective tissue, right? Also, the fact that we see that connective tissue, what we can make out as connective tissue underneath that row of cells, should also help you determine that you're looking at epithelial tissue. Because epithelial tissue and connective tissue will always go together. So one row of cells, clearly column shaped, but even if I wanted to make sure that they're column shaped, I can look at the nuclei. They're down here toward the basal part of the cells, and they're oval shaped. So this would be simple columnar epithelial tissue. What about this type of tissue? Right? Walk through those same steps before, right? Think about the four main categories. Is it nervous tissue? No, because we don't see neurons. Is it muscle tissue? No, right? Again, we said you might be kind of thinking, oh, maybe this is smooth muscle. But then we have this kind of beige area of tissue down here. And what was the point in them showing us that part, right? So it's to help us know that what we're looking at is not smooth muscle, so we can eliminate muscle tissue. We don't see striations or intercalated discs, so it's not cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle, so it's not muscle tissue. It's not muscle tissue, it's not nervous tissue. Could it be connective tissue? Maybe, right? But then when we think about epithelial tissue, we see a bunch of cells here, like different rows of cells, and then we see connective tissue adjacent to it. So that should tell you that it's epithelial tissue. So from there, all you have to do is figure out how to classify it. So it's multiple rows. Look at that apical layer. The nuclei are squished. So stratified squamous. For this type of tissue, right? Walk through those steps again. It's not nervous tissue. Could it be muscle tissue? Do we see clearly defined cells that could be any of the three types of muscle tissue? No, right? We don't see like the rectangular shaped cells of cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and we don't even see the elongation of the cells that are in smooth muscle. So it's not muscle. What about epithelial tissue? We're not seeing any well-defined cells, so it's not epithelial tissue. So then it has to be some type of connective tissue. Is it blood? I don't see any cells, so it's not blood. Is it bone? I don't see those osteomes, those tree trunk structures, so it's not bone. So then it either has to be cartilage or connective tissue proper. Cartilage would have lacunae. I don't see any lacunae here. So it has to be connective tissue proper. Connective tissue proper loose would have cells. Connective tissue proper dense wouldn't have clearly defined cells, but you would see a lot of fibers. So based on that, we can eliminate connective tissue proper loose. So it's got to be one of the types of connective tissue proper dense. Does it look like a fluid pattern to what we're looking at? So it can't be irregular. So it's either regular or elastic. Elastic is where we see those very dense fibers that are coiled and packed together. These fibers are what we're looking at here, even if you can't tell that they're fibers necessarily, they're not coiled, right? They look more kind of relaxed and fluid. So then we can settle on connective tissue proper, dense, regular. All right. Something else you'll need to be able to do for the practical, be able to look at certain organs and identify what the organ is, and then tell me what type of tissue is the predominant type of tissue you would find in that organ. So your organs will be made up of multiple types of tissue, yes, but certain organs will be predominantly one type of tissue. So for this example, what type of tissue is found in this organ? The first thing you would need to do is be able to identify that what you're looking at is the heart, right? That should be simple enough. Then I want you to think about what type of tissue would predominantly make up the heart, right? So this is where you have to think about all the different types of tissues. If you have a list in front of you, think about which one of those is the main tissue that you're only going to find in the heart, right? There was one type of tissue that we said is only found in the heart: cardiac muscle tissue. Right? And then also be able to look at the image of a tissue type and not only identify it, but tell me what's the function of that tissue. So this is kind of a two-step process, right? The first step, you have to identify what tissue it is you're looking at, and then think about what the general function of that tissue is. So for this tissue, first you're going to identify it, right? Using those same steps that we've gone through. You're going to think about the four main types of tissue. You're going to say, is it nervous tissue? No. Is it muscle tissue? No. Is it epithelial tissue? No. So it's got to be a type of connective tissue. Is it blood? No. Is it bone? No. Is it cartilage? Do we see lacunae? We see circular structures here, but we don't see the nucleus representing the cell inside, like the center. So not cartilage. So it has to be connective tissue proper, right? Do we see fibers? No. So it has to be, if we don't see if we know it's connective tissue proper and we don't see fibers, it has to be connective tissue proper loose. So then, is it areolar? We don't see fibers. If it was areolar, we would see some fibers, not a lot, but some. So it's not areolar. Is it reticular? Again, we don't see any fibers. If it was reticular, we would see a few. So then it has to be adipose. Connective tissue proper, loose, adipose. So then what's the function of adipose tissue? Right? Adipose is meant for storing fuel reserves and providing cushioning. Right? So if I just ask for one function, you could give either one. You could say that it stores fuel, right? The fat within adipose tissue stores or serves as an energy reserve. Or you could tell me that it's providing cushioning. All right? So I've provided a PDF in Canvas that has all the different tissue types in slides where you can go through and practice and quiz yourself. So like one slide will just have the image and you can look at it and try to figure out what it is, and then the next slide will give you the answer, and then some of the slides will also help you practice and study functions of tissues, as well as identifying some basic common organs and thinking about what tissues predominantly make up those organs.